Hey fearsome friends, tonight I've got some nail-biting stories for you. From attempted murder to creepy people at the front door. The human race really beggars belief. So sit back, relax and get cozy, comfy, warm. Because it's time to let your nightmares in. In 2008, I was driving from New Orleans, LA to Eugene, Oregon. It was just me, a 22-year-old female, and my year-old pit bull in a 14-foot U-Haul truck with everything I owned crammed into the back. I had a fancy flip phone and my printout of MapQuest directions. I think the first smartphones had actually come out around that time, but I didn't have one yet. Cell phone service was also much spottier, and there were long stretches through the desert where I had zero service for hundreds of miles. As I was driving a lonely stretch of highway through central Texas, I realized I hadn't seen a town or exit for a very long time, and my giant U-Haul was really low on gas. But just when I was about to freak out and seriously run out of gas, I saw a small town coming up. As I came into the town, I could tell it was tiny, but I was so worried about other things that I never paid attention to the name of the place. There were only about 6 streets in the whole town. But I found a gas station, filled up, and got ready to get back on the road. Except I could not for the life of me find my way back to the highway. I circled the town about 4 times and started getting frustrated, because this is such a tiny town. How the hell could I not find my way out? I could literally see the highway, but couldn't get to it. I returned to the gas station to ask for directions. Now when I got gas, I paid at the pump and never went in. But when I entered the place, there was a skinny, nondescript guy who had black hair hanging down in front of his eyes, and it looked like it could use a good wash. He wasn't particularly creepy, but was a little rude. He never really met my eyes and was looking down at a magazine. He gave me some directions that just didn't sound right at all, telling me to take a road that would get me to the highway in about 17 miles. For a moment I was dumbfounded. Then I pointed out that I didn't drive that far to get from the highway into town, so why so far to get back to the highway? I could literally see it from the town. He was so casual, almost like I was just an annoyance and couldn't care less if I followed his directions or not. Why should he care? He gave me some explanation about the road curving around that also didn't really make sense, and he still wasn't looking at me. He had an attitude of, "Whatever, I gave you your directions," and waved his hand in the direction of the door. When I got back into the parking lot, my whole body started trembling violently, and my heart started racing, seemingly for no reason. I got into my truck, and as soon as I put the key into the ignition, I burst into tears. I just had the most terrible feeling that no matter how nonchalant he'd acted, this man had bad intentions. I didn't know what, but I knew right then and there that there was no way that I was going to follow his directions. But this was the only store in this little town, and short on knocking on doors, no thank you, there was no one else to ask for directions. I decided that I didn't give a crap though, and if this town seemed like it had come straight out of the Twilight Zone, I was going to drive around until I found my own way out, even if it took me all damn night. Then a big red beater of a pickup truck, which had as much rust as metal, pulled up and disgorged the quintessential Texan man. Huge, husky, and in flannel and work boots. Without even thinking about it, I jumped out of the truck and approached him quickly, yet warily. Looking into his eyes, I saw a kind human being, or at least I hoped I was. I asked him if he could please give me the directions to the highway. I told him I knew it was silly, but I just couldn't seem to find my way back. He looked concerned as I was visibly upset, so he made me laugh and very cheerfully gave me directions for a hairpin curve turn-off right at the end of a small concrete tunnel that I had passed several times. He said it often confused travellers because it was so hard to see, and they need to put up signs, etc. With a sinking feeling in my stomach, I asked him how far in miles it was back to the highway. He laughed and gave me a funny look. "Miles, miss? I'd say it's a quarter mile at most. You can see the highway right from here." At this point I couldn't help it. I had to know. "So what happens if I drive?" And I gave him the directions the man in the store had given me. Texas looked at me very intently and asked me how I knew about that route, as it was pretty far out and usually only locals knew about it. So I told him. He was quiet for a few minutes, and then asked what the attendant looked like, and if I had a map of the state. Nope, just my MapQuest, which wasn't helpful in this situation. He went to his truck and grabbed a raggedy local map from his glove box. Opening it up for me, he traced the route I'd described, and the way the man from the gas station had told me to go led away from town, away from the interstate, and led to seemingly the middle of nowhere. Texas told me that the road did go about 17 miles right before it dead-ended in the desert. I asked him what was out there, and he told me it was nothing but some junked cars and a few trailers and mobile homes, all owned by the same family. This family was known locally as troublemakers, meth heads, and alcoholics, and these were the nice things townspeople had to say about them, and the erstwhile clerk was part of this family and lived down that road. I'll never forget the look in Texas's eyes as he told me this. He also told me that I was smart to listen to my instincts, and he told me to be careful travelling out there. I don't know if what the man from the gas station wanted was in the back of my U-Haul or what was in the driver's seat, but thankfully I didn't have to find out. Oh, and I learned that sometimes angels look like ruddy-haired Texans with scruffy faces and rusty pickups. Thank you, random Texan stranger. You really saved my ass, and I will always remember you with tons of love. Sorry that I didn't ask your name. You'll be forever known as Texas to me now. Let me start this off by letting you know that I was living close to a metropolitan area for a little over a year before moving back to my tiny 10,000 population hometown. Before that, I was at college and other places, etc., and I didn't interact with anyone from my hometown besides family for many years. I'd even deactivated Facebook for a few years too. But fast forward to the fall of 2020, when I moved into a house in the tiny town. So one chilly fall night, I decided it was the perfect time to relax and get inebriated off of many glasses of wine. I was relaxing on the couch with my girlfriend, when we suddenly heard someone knock on the front door. It was around midnight, so she immediately told me not to answer it, but got up to at least pull up the blinds on the glass portion of the door to see who it was. She saw a meek-looking girl, probably younger than 20, standing on our porch with a blanket and a bag. I was shaken up by this, because in a town like this, in the Midwest, there literally are no homeless people, because the town is so small. People usually have a support network when things go sour. I asked the girl what she wanted, and she said that she was homeless and needed a place to stay. My drunk self thought that it was an amazing time to fulfill my need of helping the world by opening my front door to let her stay in the guest bedroom. My girlfriend immediately sat her down and was asking her questions, and thinking back, her answers were pretty vague. Eventually she told us that she'd knocked on every door down the street to find a place to stay because she'd gotten into a fight with her mum. So she wasn't homeless. It was also odd to think that a young girl would do that considering the danger. Eventually we found out that she was going to the same private school that I went to from the 1st to 6th grade, except the college extension of the same campus. So we were kind of bonding on that, talking about the campus, because it's the new age bullcrap school run by boomers. But then she mentioned that she had a no-contact order for sitting at the same table as someone at the school. My drunk self did not register no contact meant restraining order. So we were talking, and then she said that she'd recognized me from Facebook. I was alarmed, especially because I'd never seen this girl before in my life, and we have an almost 10-year age gap. She told me it was because I'd posted a local rental on the Facebook home share. It was for my mum, who was a realtor without Facebook. So, okay, that's reasonable. Small town. But then she tells me that she knows my mum. And this is equally alarming, because my mum and I have different last names, and she doesn't have social media or any way to connect us. Another thing my drunk self registered only the next morning. Fast forward to the morning. She says she's going to leave, and I ask her if she wants a ride home, because it's cold out. As I drove down the street several miles, I realized she does live on the same street, but she also would have had to pass at least 5 developments and many rows of houses to get to my house. Was I really the only one to answer the door, or did she target my house? The next day my girlfriend and I both discussed how odd that was and how many things didn't add up. Later in the day we came back home from the store, and we saw the girl in the front of our house again. I panicked because I'm horrible with confrontation, and my girlfriend said, "You let her into our house, you deal with it." She stayed in the car, and I asked the girl what was going on. She asked again if she could stay with us. I panicked and asked my girlfriend to come out of the car, and my girlfriend told her that she didn't know if she had a gun or who she was, and she could only stay with us if she opened up to us about everything and why she's not going home. We sat her down in the kitchen and nicely grilled her, only to get vague answers again. To be honest, initially I was concerned it was an abuse situation, but it turned out it wasn't. At this point, she was in our house and we don't know how to get her out. By a stroke of luck, she said she was leaving to go to the dining hall and would come back later. We quickly taped signs on both the front and back doors that read, "Landlord won't allow additional tenants. Best to go back to your mum's." It was later in the evening and dark out at this point, when we heard banging on the front door. It stopped eventually. We were upstairs, and we knew it was her, so we just waited it out for an hour. Then I walked downstairs to check, because we were starving and wanted to use the kitchen. I decided to take literally one finger and slide one blind shade up from another to peek through the kitchen glass doors. And she was standing there facing me in the pitch black on my back deck. After an hour. I looked her dead in the eye and then turned around and went upstairs. Time passed and she eventually left. When I opened the door, we noticed she'd taken the handwritten notes. As the next day rolled by, everybody's mum and cousin was lecturing and laughing at me about opening my door to a stranger, which to be honest I would never have done normally, but the whole thing wasn't sitting well with me, and I needed more information. I posted something on Facebook about it, and a boy I went to elementary school with messaged me asking me if it was Rachel, because she had an obsession with him that led to a restraining order. He advised me that she's probably harmless, but not to respond to her. She hasn't come back since, and I still have no clue why she showed up or how she knew me. It cost me the purchase of a Ring security system, but it could have been worse. My boyfriend John and I went to hang out with his best friend Mike and his current girlfriend, and she knew about a party that was going on with some of her childhood friends who had just finished high school. We seemingly arrived at the party that was in the middle of nowhere, and there were a bunch of people hanging out in the front yards of a few homes, drinking beer and just hanging around. It was very strange to me, and we felt out of place. People were whispering about us and pointing us out. I assumed because it was a small town where everyone knew each other. But then some other boys started mocking my boyfriend's shirt that was a Lacoste polo. "You a rich boy, huh?" the first boy said. "You think you're better than us or something?" Now my boyfriend was not rich. He'd just gotten a lot of hand-me-downs from his boss after he'd gained a few pounds, but we just laughed it off. After a little while of just standing around, someone decided we were going to go to a friend's house who had a pool. We all followed, thinking someone's actual home might be less strange than just hanging out in random front yards. When we arrived, there were some girls in the pool, fully clothed. They seemed nice enough, just drunk, and some people were hanging outside in the driveway. Now I have a prosthetic leg, so I get tired if I stand up for too long, so I decided to sit down on the back of a truck. After a while, a dude approached us and sat down next to me. I was pretty naive at the time, and had never received much attention from the opposite sex. I'd grown up in a small town in a different state. We were in Georgia. I grew up in Texas. And the dude started telling us how he was from New York and asking me questions about my life. Just then he put his hand on my knee and made a comment about my looks, saying I was cute. My boyfriend was there, and I felt safe enough not to react, but my blood was boiling. I shrugged and laughed off his comments, trying to act uninterested, but in reality I was frozen in an uncomfortable state of weirdness. I had no idea where John's friend Mike was, much less his girlfriend, who actually might know these people. John was watching, waiting for me to say something, which I didn't. I don't know why, but I just didn't like the attention this guy was giving me. He wasn't attractive and didn't seem like a fun or cool guy, but just an obvious drunk creep. His hand started moving up my thigh when I piped up and said something like, "Yeah, I'm not interested. That's my boyfriend right there." "Oh, well, that's okay. He doesn't seem to mind," he said. When just then my boyfriend grabbed him by the throat and said, "Get your hands off of her." The guy started to get scared and was frantically apologizing, when suddenly someone ran out of the woods and tackled my boyfriend. It was the owner of the home, and he had been passed out in his truck for the past 4 hours, but had come to in time to see a complete stranger choking out his friend. 3 guys ran up on him, and John managed to fight off 2 of them, but the host of the party had him in a headlock, and he held him until he almost lost consciousness. They fell to the ground with the host on top of him, pressing down on his throat and cutting off his ability to breathe. I tried to hit him and beat him off, but he had this glazed-over look in his eyes and seemed determined to kill him. I laid on him, digging my prosthetic knee into his back. John's friend was nowhere to be seen, and the party host finally let go of my boyfriend, and we ran to our car. Mike and his girlfriend were close behind, obviously aware of what was happening the whole time. The next morning, the white of John's eyes were all red and full of blood. I really believe that he'd almost died that night. We decided to go to the cops. This was in a place called Rockdale County, a backwoods, nasty country town. But I didn't realize how terrible it was until we were inside the sheriff's office. They claimed that they had gotten a report that I had taken my leg off and beaten people with it, which, by the way, isn't possible. The police said that the only way we could press charges was if we all went to jail, because it was all hearsay, and the cop knew the attacker, family friends, and they would never assault someone unless they deserved it. We had to walk away. Now in my hometown, there's a huge lake. This place was big and desolate and ideal for camping, fishing and hunting. I live in Norway, and we have something called every man's right, which basically says that you can roam free wherever you want in the country, as long as it's not private property. For this reason, Norwegians love to walk around in nature, and where there is more than enough room for everyone, people usually don't accumulate. So my friend and I were planning a camping trip. We were going to head up the river by boat and go to an island in the middle of the lake. When we got there, we found an ideal spot, and the place had probably been inhabited by campers before us. But one thing that creeped me out, though, was a northern pike's head hanging in a tree by a fireplace. It was huge, and it looked down on the camping site with its dead and dried eyes. But this aside, what happened after dark is what I'm here to tell you about. We had been sitting around the campfire for hours, eating, drinking, and talking crap. It was summertime, and summers in Norway are not very dark due to its placement on Earth, but around 1 to 2 a.m. it is quite dark. Now, I noticed something on the lake. I couldn't make out what it was, and I didn't really care at that time. So after a while we went to our tents and went to sleep. I'd had some very strange dreams that night. I saw the pike we'd come across earlier, and it was moving its eyes, making sounds, and the skies were changing colours. I saw a man on the lake, and the water was evaporating, but would then rain down again. The pike said something and laughed, and that's when I suddenly woke up sweating. I looked around and looked at my phone. It was still night time. I was only 14 years old, so my brain wasn't fully developed yet, and underage drinking certainly didn't help. But I was afraid, and I had no idea why. It was the kind of fright where you just don't want to see something. I didn't want to open the tent, so I just laid completely still and pretended to be asleep. But then I heard noises from the dream, noises that the head on the tree out there had made. I became stiff. I could feel the blood being pumped throughout my body, and I heard people shouting. The noises were no more than 100 meters away, and it was more than 100 meters to land. The island we were staying on was small. You could probably walk around it in 5 minutes. The human voices continued and were shouting and laughing. It was the laughter that got to me. It was this kind of ugly laughter. It didn't sound like people were having fun. At some point it felt like someone was walking towards our campsite, and I became terrified, just lying there completely still. At some point I must have fallen asleep again, as I woke up early the next morning. My friend was also up, and I asked him if he'd heard the noises. He hadn't, so I wondered if it had all been just a dream. But then I saw something on the lake. It was a man. He was just standing there on some type of crude raft, about 200 meters away from us. He looked our way, but I couldn't make out any facial features. He looked pale. My heart started pounding. The man stood out there for hours, and we got so creeped out that we eventually packed our stuff and went home. Luckily we had a motorboat, so he could have never caught up with us, but I still remember the way he'd looked at us as we'd left the lake and went on to the river. He just stood there, and then it dawned on me. What I saw on the lake in the darkness the night before was probably him. He had been standing there the whole time. Was he responsible for the voices I'd heard? I knew that we were alone on the small island, and this wasn't really a place where drunk teenagers went on a spontaneous trip in the middle of the night. But had he placed the fish head in the tree to scare people off? Did we step onto his sacred ground or something? And maybe most importantly, why was he standing on a raft out there on the lake? Did he set foot on the island while we were sleeping? Was he planning to do anything to us? And who was he shouting and laughing at? I don't know, and I haven't been back there since. My friend and I both still get a little creeped out whenever someone mentions the Raft Man. I knew Robert Fischer. and it's absolutely surreal to know someone in real life who is on the FBI's top 10 most wanted list, America's most wanted and unsolved mysteries. I attended Pima Elementary School in Scottsdale, Arizona, from the late 90s to the early 2000s, with his kids, Brittany and Bobby. Brittany and I were the same age, in the same grade, and we were both on the honor roll and played on the same basketball team together. Bobby, Robert Jr., was about 2 years younger than us, I believe. He didn't seem like the typical annoying little brother, though, and Brittany always involved him, cared and looked out for him. Their mother Mary was very sweet and very involved in their lives and our school functions. We all attended the same church together a few times, and the kids were even in the choir. Brittany was a typical preteen. She had a lot of friends, was funny, smart and polite, as was Bobby. Typical kids, they were both pretty shy and quiet, but also very kind, and everybody loved them. I know people say this stuff all the time about others that are no longer with us, but this is the honest to God's truth. They really were good kids. Robert came to some of our basketball games and sat all the way in the back of the stands, alone and silent, totally antisocial. My father tried to converse with him a few times, to no avail. He didn't like Robert at all. He just had these cold eyes that just looked right past you. He never cheered or congratulated Brittany. It seemed more like he had to be there rather than actually wanted to be. He honestly gave me the heebie-jeebies. You could tell he was a strict parent, not a huggable guy that tells his kids he loves them. He was a hunter, a military guy, avid outdoorsman, and more importantly, just a huge POS. On a regular weekday morning, the news was on and I was called into the living room where my parents were watching breaking news. Live on TV was Brittany and Bobby's house, up in flames. At this point, no one knew if anyone was in the house or not, and I just remember praying that they were safe. It took a while for the fire to be put out, but once it was, the news was grim. Mary was found with a slit throat and a gunshot wound to the head, and the kids' throats were also cut. How scared they must have been still breaks my heart. The police said they were found in their beds, so my hope and wish is that they were sleeping. It was absolutely tragic. Robert was nowhere to be found as days went by. Our school was filled with grief counselors, and a lot of my classmates went by the house to pray for the family and place signs there. It was a horrific shock to our community, and news stations played it out for days on end. There was so much speculation as to what had happened. Robert's parents were in complete denial that he would do such a thing. Who could blame them? And insisted that someone else had done it, and he must be in some sort of trouble. Some people even speculated it had to do with some sort of gambling debt that he owed. We come to find that he'd cheated on his wife in the past. They had some sort of argument the night before. I'm not sure if that's what the fight was even about or not. But she wanted to leave him, and he just couldn't handle the thought of a divorce. His truck and his dog were found over a week later in Tonto National Forest, about 50 miles north. The whole situation is gut-wrenching and heartbreaking. What I still can't get over is the fact that he brought his dog along with him, but brutally murdered his children. It sickens me to the core. Needless to say, the police scoured the woods for days and didn't find any other piece of evidence as to where he could have gone. Some people believe he'd killed himself, and some people, like myself, believe he's still out there on the run under an assumed identity. It would make me feel better to think he was dead and burning in hell for what he did. But he was such an avid outdoorsman, like I'd previously stated, that I believe he absolutely could have survived in those woods and got away. I even think he could have used those woods as a diversion for the police before he left and went somewhere else. They never found his body, so it's not too hard to imagine. He could have fled to Mexico and could be living a carefree life somewhere. But I hope he's caught in his lifetime, so Mary's family can get closure and justice, and this piece of crap can rot in prison where he belongs. So a couple of years ago, I was couch surfing near Times Square, New York City. One night, my host informed me they'd be out late, so I decided to have a night out on the town. I started on foot, and eventually music pulled me into a little spot that felt just right. After dancing for a while, I stepped outside for a cigarette. There was a man in the smoking area, let's call him AS, and he asked if I wanted some Alka-Seltzer. Taken aback, I laughed at what I'd assumed to be a thinly veiled drug reference. He asked what a good girl was doing alone in a place like this, and cautioned me about local dynamics. Some of AS's acquaintances folded into the conversation, and we shared some laughs and doobies. They were handsome and charming, so when AS asked them to keep an eye out for me on the dance floor, I couldn't have been more pleased. They followed me inside, while AS remained outside, presumably selling Alka-Seltzer, whatever that means. Now those gentlemen showed me an unforgettable time and made me feel safe and respected, like older brothers who refused to cross the line. Drinks never ran dry, and I've never before or since experienced a dance floor with that much soul. When the music ended, the crowd started making its beat, and we danced our way out. Once outside, I checked my phone to see if I'd heard back from the couch surfing host yet, but I had nothing. I sparked a ciggy and began mentally preparing myself to sleep in my camperized car, when AS invited me to join everyone at the after-party. It was my night on the town in the Big Apple, so I figured why not. We took the subway to an infamous borough and found our way to an average-looking building on a sleepy street. Bouncers appeared as we approached a side gate, then stepped to the side to allow AS and his entourage through. AS introduced me to the DJ, bartender, bouncers, and other key players, as if I was his significant other. He was trying to be close and physical, but I made it clear that I'd arrived as a part of a group and would be leaving solo. I tried dancing with friends from the club, but they were different now that he was in the room. It suddenly made sense why no one had crossed that gentlemanly line and danced as close as I'd wanted them to earlier. AS had laid claim to me. Before long, I began losing control of my faculties, just as AS was becoming increasingly possessive. I suspect I had been drugged and began fearing for my safety. I asked others to distract AS while I slipped out without him, but everyone adamantly declined. Things started fading for me fast, but I remember pleading with the last remaining gentleman from the club earlier to not leave me alone with AS. As his taxi drove away, I will never forget his defeated expression as he eerily made the sign of the cross. AS waited on the sidewalk as the bouncers locked the gates. The danger of the situation seemed to override whatever drugs I'd been given, as I kicked into overdrive and sprinted down the street, looking for refuge. He caught up with me after a couple of blocks and threw me to the ground, where we rolled around throwing punches. That is my last memory for 3 days. You see, 3 days later, things were very much the same. Me trying to convince bystanders to distract him while I left, them suspiciously declining, me bolting down the street, then him catching me and starting a fist fight. Many bystanders yelled from their windows and threatened to call the cops, but nobody actually intervened. Eventually he stopped at a friend's place, assuming he had broken me. I gathered that his friend was the Alpha, managed to build rapport, then brazenly asked to speak with him privately. AS refused to give us privacy, but his friend was truly the Alpha, and kicked him out of the room. I explained the situation and told him he's welcome to call the cops, but I refused to leave without reasonable assurance AS wouldn't follow. He apologized for my plight and assured me I could leave safely, and called in a couple of other friends for backup. I walked right past AS out the front door, and he tried to follow me, but was met with violent 3.1 resistance as I ran to the nearest subway and hopped the first train, desperately hoping we'd never meet again. So my boyfriend, who was 23, and I, who was 22, had moved to the very end of an island about 6 months ago. It's a second-level condo and is part of a club-type thing. It's pretty much any people above the age of 60 who are living here, which isn't bad, but I definitely get the vibe that we are disturbing their community. It's a really peaceful atmosphere and has a really low crime rate. Recently we took our condo off the market and are in the process of selling it and moving. As while beautiful, it's incredibly isolated here, and I think if I stayed here any longer I'd lose my sanity. So to get to our front door you have to go up a set of stairs on the side of the building, and ours is the end unit. We have one window right above our sink that faces out towards the stairs and right by our door. A few days before I'd left to go back to my home state, my boyfriend had to stay because of work, we heard a knock at our door. I went to check who it was at the little window first, and was met with a woman that seemed in her 60s, arms crossed and leaning against the railing, and was staring directly into our window at me with a smirk on her face. She didn't look intimidating, just creepy, and I didn't feel like interacting, so I ignored her. All was well the last few days I was there. The day came when I was back in my home state, and my boyfriend casually mentioned on the phone that someone had been knocking, but we brushed it off and thought nothing more of it. Then the next day, my boyfriend got home from work and went to take his daily after-work dump, but as soon as he sat down he heard the doorbell ring and a knock. He didn't answer and they were gone by the time he'd gotten down there. This happened again the next day, except they did it twice while he was there. Today they came and rang the doorbell right as he had gone to take a nap, but they rang the doorbell repeatedly, followed with loud knocking. Up to this point we had thought it was the new homeowners, wanting to chat some more, since they were close by and we'd had a few run-ins before, so we called them up to see if it was them, but they said that they hadn't stopped by at all. 2 hours after this we were on FaceTime, and someone started ringing the doorbell aggressively again, immediately followed with a bunch of loud knocks. My boyfriend was kind of freaked out at this point, as we know nobody down there, and haven't done anything to warrant someone doing this on a daily basis, especially since they'd become so aggressive with it. I told him to go stand by the door next time, just to check and see if they'd try to turn the knob or listen for their voice or footsteps. I told him that when they start to walk away, peek around to the window to see if you can get a look at them, or just ask them what they want through the door. If they don't give a solid answer, then tell them to piss off and leave us alone. I was pretty worried for him actually, as we have a young Frenchie that we take out a lot, and I know that dogs locally have been going missing recently. I don't know if that's far-fetched, but it still worries me, especially when my boyfriend has to go to work for a few hours. The only person I can think of that might be doing this is the woman that lives there, who I reckon is around maybe 30. Even before this had all started happening, he'd mentioned how she'd seemed off, as in maybe not all mentally there. I'd never noticed her myself, but my boyfriend said that she's always out and nearby when he's out doing anything. She just walks around with no real direction, and it's constant. He's only pointed her out to me once before, and I got a glimpse as she walked away. So last night at around 10 p.m, my boyfriend was at the community grill finishing his brisket when he saw her walking, which is kind of strange. He saw her notice him, then cut into the grass right next to him, walking right by him and into the grass space behind the condos we always take our dog to on the way back home. Now I don't know if it's maybe her. Does anyone have any suggestions as to what it might be? What possibilities could there be for why someone would be knocking like this? I was 15 when this happened, so I think it's safe for me to post this without fearing that the individual in this story might come across this post and find me. I was lying in bed watching TV, and I had the house to myself, as my mom had gone out to get groceries. When the credits to the show I was watching started to roll, I noticed in the reflection of the black screen that someone was standing by my doorway. The moment I saw this figure, I just froze and was completely paralyzed with fear, to the point that my head started heating up. I felt like I was about to faint. Somehow, though, I racked up the nerve to turn my head and see if someone was actually there. And to my relief, there wasn't, so I put it down to me just seeing things. Or so I thought. I went back to watching TV, when minutes later I received a text from my neighbor, letting me know that Charlie, my dog, was out on the street. Now, my neighbor is really old and has poor eyesight, so I assumed he was mistaking Charlie for another dog, but I nonetheless looked around to confirm Charlie's absence. After calling his name and receiving no response, I stood up and headed downstairs towards the living room, as Charlie likes to rest there. However, on my way down, I noticed that the front door was open. I got chills. It was at this moment I realized that the figure I'd seen earlier wasn't just me seeing things. I immediately proceeded to walk out the door, but as I did, the sound of footsteps running down the stairs could be heard from behind me. I bolted out of there as fast as I could and ran straight to my neighbor's house. I told him what had happened, so he called the police. When the cops arrived at my house, they inspected the place but couldn't find anyone, except for a switchblade that the intruder must have dropped as he bolted out of the house upon hearing the sirens of police cars a mile away. If it hadn't have been for my neighbor's text, I'm sure I would have made the headlines. So I live in a rather rural area, the kind of place where you both know and don't want to know what to expect. People here tend to be latched onto the older way of thinking and living, and I'm all for that. But that being said, it's easy to assume that nothing much happens here. At least nothing that would really raise any red flags. The thing is, though, about 5 years ago, something abnormal did happen, and I thought I was going to lose my life due to a case of wrong place, wrong time, in the parking lot of an all-you-can-eat buffet. I was in middle school at the time, was having one of my worst school years yet, and luck didn't seem to be on my side. So of course this day wouldn't be any different. My family, Grandpa, Mom and little sister, had gone to church that morning, and taken my friend and her younger sister as well. Once it was over, my mum decided that we'd treat ourselves to an early lunch, and headed over to a local all-you-can-eat buffet. It was a humble place, and the atmosphere of the farm around it was peaceful. It lulled you into a sense of security. So we were waiting in the lobby area and sitting on a bench, when two women came in who both seemed to be in their 40s. The taller of them was obviously the leader of the two, and the shorter woman seemed to hang back, letting the other do the talking, chiming in here and there. The taller woman was gushing over how adorable my sister was to her. She was in elementary school at the time, and kept saying how she looked like a princess. We thought she was just an overly expressive and nice woman, and left it at that as we walked to our table to get settled in. Fast forward through the meal, and we were eating our desserts. I had gotten my usual, that being a mixed vanilla and chocolate ice cream, topped off with Oreo bits, caramel and 2 marshmallows covered in chocolate from the chocolate fountain. Yes, I know, I kinda went overboard, but whatever, I was a kid. I was about 3/4 of the way done with my dish, when the two ladies suddenly appeared at our table. I immediately thought it was odd that they deliberately searched us out in there, but kept eating regardless. The woman got to talking about herself and revealed that she was a church official. She claimed to work in a sort of crisis centre at her church, located in Delaware, where she mainly worked with kids who were the victims of abuse or rape. Her friend, though, I can't remember whether she actually told us anything about herself, but if she did, none of us can recall it. They then told my mum and grandpa that they had a gift for my sister, and I'll admit, I was kind of jealous upon hearing that. Of course she was getting a gift. The woman pulled some letters out of her purse and showed them to my mum and sister. She told us she was a pen pal of sorts with Princess Kate, but I would later learn from my mum that the letters were basically automatic replies, not actual letters from Kate herself. So nothing special, really. It's like the equivalent of getting the answering machine to a secretary in the mail. But nonetheless, my mum went along with it anyway. Then, to my surprise, the woman said she had a gift for me. But unlike the gift for my sister, which had been in her purse, she said mine was in her car. Red flags immediately went in my head. There was no way in hell I was going with this random lady, alone, out to her car. My mum to this day leaves me dumbfounded as to what she was thinking, and told her that I could go, so long as my grandpa went with me. My grandpa gave my mum a, "What are you talking about? Why should we go with them?" look, then turned to me. I hesitated, but we walked out with the two women. At this point, knowing the head woman was a church official, I figured she was going to give me a Bible or something. My grandpa in his late 50s seemed uneasy and stuck close to me, and as we approached her car, I saw that it was in fact not a car at all. It was a van, a white van. Cliché, I know, but it's the truth. We followed the two women over, and the leader walked over to the passenger side. We were right behind her, but had failed to notice the other woman was lagging behind and placed herself between us and the exit between the van and the other car. The lead woman was in front of us, which meant we were boxed in with no way out. The leader unlocked the doors to the van and pulled open the sliding door, ducking inside. My grandpa seemed to tense up. His eyes were darting around. He had noticed the other woman was blocking us off and was on edge. He had a bad feeling about this and was fully prepared to fight these women to save me if needs be. Then something that I never would have dreamed of happening, happened. The woman, after rummaging around in her van, emerged wielding a sword. And not some fake prop sword that you get at Party City or something. A legit sword that was glinting in the grey autumn light, its hilt adorned with details and jewels. I just about crapped my pants and thought this was the end. I was going to die by the blade of some psychotic church official in the parking lot of a rural buffet. My grandpa's eyes became wide, and I saw his hands clenched into fists as he was preparing to knock this woman out. It all seemed to move in slow motion, taking forever, but was only a few seconds. And then, as my life flashed before my eyes, this woman asked us what our names were. The sword was still in her hand, but she didn't swing it at us. I was terrified, thinking this woman was the kind of killer who likes to know her victims' names before doing the deed. I told her my name, and she then performed some sort of small ceremony, reciting some religious statements, and lowered the blade to touch both of my shoulders one at a time. She then brought it down to my head and raised it, bringing it in front of herself, straight into the air, and proclaimed me Sir Ben, a knight of God. She asked the same of my grandpa, and after getting his name, did the same for him. She told us that she hoped we liked our gifts, and still a bit shell-shocked, we thanked her, and my grandpa and I left the two women. We sped-walked inside, found our table, and proceeded to fill my mum in on what had just happened. She didn't believe us at first, but we soon convinced her. My grandpa and I both scolded her for making us go with those women, my grandpa being especially angry. If that woman had have had other intentions with that sword, we both would have been dead. The women didn't come back over to us, and oddly enough we didn't see them when leaving. We never saw those women again, thankfully, and suffice to say I'm glad. They weirded me out, and I just hoped they'd gone back to Delaware where they belonged. Maybe they could knight some other random strangers along the way. It's been half a decade now since the day my grandpa and I were proclaimed knights. My close friends sometimes refer to me as Sir Ben, which I find funny, but I never let my mum live it down, prodding her about it whenever I get the chance. All in good fun, of course. It's also a fantastic story to tell people and get them interested in you, and no one I've met has been able to top me when we get to sharing. Now, one last thing that has always lingered in the back of my mind, something that still unsettles me to this day. About 2 weeks prior to this incident, there had been some beheadings a few states over that had made the news. It makes me wonder, could it have been those two ladies? Was I knighted by a murderer? This happened about 4 years ago, a time when I was healthier than I am now, and therefore used to run a lot in my neighborhood and its surroundings, especially at night. Although where I live is considered one of the best neighborhoods in my city, I still always carried with me, half hidden, a black tack lifestyle pocket knife. Although I always thought that it was unlikely that I would need to defend myself using my knife, just having it with me made me feel safer and protected, so to speak. Sometimes I would wear sportswear, and other times I just dressed normally, with jeans and a shirt, but with sports tennis shoes. I was wearing the latter when this happened, on one of these particular nights. I was walking along a street on the outskirts of my neighborhood, quite tired after running, towards a house where there were 4 boys outside who were just talking amongst themselves. I made my way past them, looked at them and smiled, then continued walking. A few minutes after coming across those boys, one of them, who seemed to be about my age, who I will call X, approached me abruptly and stood in front of me, preventing me from going any further. He was familiar to me, but I didn't know where from. I definitely thought I'd seen him before, when the following conversation began. I was starting to get nervous. "Excuse me," I said. He got closer to me, forcing me to go back into a wall of a nearby house, so I immediately knew that this guy X was going to be a problem for me. "Hey, where are you going? What do you have with you?" When he said this, I knew right then that this guy was going to try to assault me. This obviously made me quite nervous, so I instinctively put my hand into my pocket where I had my trusty knife. I did this as covertly as possible, and started preparing to use it against this guy if the situation got any worse. "It's none of your business. Let me go my way," I replied with a laugh. "Shut up. This is an assault. Give me what you have," he demanded. I quickly sized up the situation and realized that X had no weapon with him to assault me. It was just intimidation that he had. Straight away I knew that I had the advantage over him, simply because I had my knife, so I was able to calm down a little bit. I pushed him with my free hand, the one I didn't have with the knife, and said, "Get out of my way, you idiot. I don't want any trouble with you." X got closer to me, so I took out my knife, and without thinking too much, I directed it towards his stomach. When he saw this, he was immediately scared and quickly moved away from me. "What is wrong with you? Take it easy, I'm just playing with you, Em." He said my real name, so I knew then that I was right in thinking we'd met before. I felt reassured, but was still alarmed. The other boys cautiously approached us. "What the hell, you idiot? We know each other. How do you know my name?" I asked. "Yeah, man, we know each other. You really don't remember me? We went to high school together. I'm Jeff. Put that knife away. Obviously I'm not going to assault you. It was a joke, dude." We were never great friends in those days, but we got along well enough. We both giggled nervously as I put the knife back in my pocket, after finally having recognized his face as someone I did know and who really posed no danger to me. "Ah, yes, I remember you. Well, I'm not really interested in being your friend anymore, or staying in touch, so don't follow me, okay?" I said. "Oh, I understand. Okay. But at least apologize for having almost stabbed me. I mean, it was pretty messed up what you almost did to me." "And what you did wasn't?" "Forget it, leave me alone, man." "It's okay, I get it. Take care, Em, and sorry for having scared you." I didn't answer him, just ignored him and continued on my way, but a little faster than I was walking earlier. I turned from time to time to see X and his friends, making sure they weren't following me. But they stayed where they were and just carried on talking. This happened when I was about 14 or 15, and I'm 19 now. I was in the basement of my house playing PlayStation, absent-mindedly late into the night, like I did often in those days, and being up until 3 to 4 a.m. was not unusual for me. I'd like to tell you a bit about how my house is structured. It has a main front door, but also a second set of front doors if you go down the driveway, and the basement is by these second doors. As I was getting ready to log off for the night, I suddenly could hear my dogs going crazy from upstairs. They sometimes bark at nothing, like a car passing in the night, or too much wind whipping past their window. However, as someone who has listened to too many scary stories, that was more than enough for me. So I went up the stairs and was about to go straight to my room, when I caught a glimpse of movement out of the window. I looked out and into my front yard, but couldn't see anything, when suddenly I heard my dad yell in a voice lower than his own. "Hey, can I help you?" This is what set me into pure adrenaline mode, and I stood frozen, staring out the window, as my ears strained to hear the guy's response. I still got nothing, though, before my dad continued. "Sorry, you have the wrong house. Get off the property." The guy then came into my view, and he was wearing a white sleeveless shirt and cargo pants. I watched as he walked off our front path and onto the street, then back onto the path. He was seemingly unsure of where to go or what to do. It was right then that I realized with utter dread that I hadn't locked the downstairs front door. I finally broke out of my frozen spell and ran back down the stairs to lock the front door. I took a deep breath before starting back towards the stairs, and that's when I heard it. The door handle jiggling. I didn't look back. I just booked it to the top of the stairs and to my parents' room. My dad had already called the cops. They'd arrived about half an hour later and had seemingly picked up a man from an empty house down the street that was in the process of being sold. The following day the newspaper told of an escaped convict from the max security prison here. Some sort of mix-up was made and they let the wrong person out. But luckily they caught him. Luckily enough, not giving any detail of where, and that is how I both forgot and remembered my way through a creepy encounter. So I want to put this out there for kids and their parents, that not even your employer can be trusted. It was the summer of 2004 and I was 15. I was working weekends at a skate park, running the registers, keeping shop, and I was the only female employee there. The reason I got the job, I thought at the time, was because I used to hang out there a lot. They used to host events like hardcore rock shows, and those were really fun. So it was the place where all my friends gathered for a good time, so we got to know the owners pretty well. Now the two guys that owned the shop were in their 40s, were overweight and balding. just typical older white guys that were extremely nice. Let's call them Doug and Mark. Doug was always more serious about the business, always trying to come up with ideas to better it, and rarely joked around. He was also married with kids. Mark, on the other hand, seemed like Doug's minion. He was usually out running errands, making calls, or cleaning the shop. He was a single guy and was very outgoing and silly, so we always had fun with him around. Until one day, when the fun stopped. Before I tell you about the scariest moment of my life, I'll inform you of the events, or red flags rather, leading up to it. On one occasion, we were hosting a show where a local metal band was playing. There were lots of people there, kids and adults alike, and people were skating and running up and down the ramps and bowls, just generally having a good time. Then Mark suddenly came up behind me as I was talking with my friend Katie, picked me up and swung me over his shoulder and started tickling and spinning me around, right in the middle of the crowd. I laughed it off and was yelling for him to stop in a giggly voice, but I was honestly a bit creeped out, as he had never touched me like that before, even in a friendly way. Even at 15 I found this inappropriate for a man in his 40s to be so touchy with me. And after about a minute he put me down and was laughing and apologizing. I didn't think much of it from then on, and thought maybe I was overreacting. Then a week or two went by and I noticed that Mark was giving me flirty looks and sticking his tongue out at me when he was around. Again I didn't think much of it, as he was a super nice guy, so I thought he was just being funny. But one day Mark called me into the back. We had 2 doors right behind the register that led to our stockroom, as Doug sat at the register on a business call. When we got there, he picked me up, set me on the washing machine, and told me he wanted to kiss me. I shut him down immediately, but he then tried to persuade me to lift up my shirt for him. At this point I was really freaked out, and was just hoping that Doug was going to come through the doors any second. Again I told him firmly no, as I hopped down and proceeded to walk to the shop front again. That's when Doug opened the door and asked, "Hey, what are you guys doing? Did Mark show you our butterfly collection?" I just responded with, "Oh, nah," and I walked out with the 2 of them following me. The rest of the day was pretty uneventful, but I just wanted it to end. I usually got off work around 6 or 7, but at around 5, Doug asked me to go with Mark to run some errands. He jokingly said, "Take my credit card, but don't give it to Mark." All I could think about was how awkward this ride was going to be, as we hadn't talked since the incident earlier that day. I was really dreading it, as I had no idea what was about to unfold. We got in the car and drove to my high school, which is on the other side of town, in a medium-sized, busy city, but about 5 minutes away from my house. And as we pulled into the back parking lot, I asked him what we were doing here. "I'm scouting out a new area for a skate park. It's behind the school here," he said. This is when I started to get nervous, and hoping that this was true, because I knew they were actually trying to expand the locations at the time. He got out of the car and motioned for me to get out and come along, and I hesitantly did so. We started walking to the back of the school, and he was talking about his visions of the new park. Nothing too serious, and that's when we came to the woods. Not a wooded area, a straight-up dense forest-like woods, ones you can barely walk through. And that's when he said, "Take my hand, come on, I'll show you the spot." This is when the alarms went off in my head, and I realized I could be in real danger if I go with this creep. In my head I was contemplating running, or just going along with him, because I didn't know which one would make my situation worse at the time. I now know I should have run. But this pondering seemed like it went on forever, when in reality it was probably only a few seconds. Thank God I paused a second before making any decisions though, because that's when my cell phone rang. I'd honestly forgot I had it on me. It was my mum asking me if she could pick me up early so we could go to dinner. I took this opportunity and told her with a sense of urgency that, "Yes, I'm at the high school. Come get me now." I think she could hear the fear in my voice and left immediately, because she was there in less than 5 minutes. But during those 5 minutes, I told Mark that I had to go and wait for my mum. He seemed agitated, but agreed and walked with me to the front steps of the school to wait. He didn't say bye or anything, just suddenly walked briskly to his car, and my mum showed up a couple of minutes later. I hopped in that car quicker than I've ever done anything in my life. I was shaking and told my mum that I wasn't in the mood to eat and to just drop me off at home. She asked if I was okay, and I said I was. I told her that me and a co-worker were just there scouting for a new spot. She dropped me off at home, where I just went into shock and a feeling of pure fear took over me. I quit working there that day and never went back. I didn't explain anything to anyone, and I've only told my boyfriend and a couple of friends about it. I'm 100% convinced, looking back on all of the red flags, and the fact that Doug didn't seem to trust Mark, Doug was actually a good guy, that if I had gone into those woods with Mark, I wouldn't be here today. Who knows what he would have done to me? Rape, murder, or both? It's very weird when you survive something like that, and it's never really seemed real to me, but it very much was. I have a 12-year-old daughter now, and I try to teach her about safety and predators all the time. That kind of thing can change you, and change the parent you become. About 2 years later, Mark called my house phone. I don't know how he got my number, and told me he was in Istanbul, Turkey, and about to open a skate shop there. I just told him not to call me anymore and hung up. Luckily, my nightmare was over after that, but hearing from him was like talking to the devil. I hope that man is dead or in jail, so he can't hurt anyone else. I've always wondered if Doug ever found out about Mark, and if maybe Mark had to flee the country for a crime he'd committed, landing him in Istanbul. Never trust anyone who's been a creep to you. I don't trust much of anyone anymore. Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video. And if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button. I also have a Patreon page and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. Keep being creepy.